Thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to be in this conference, see friends, and present this paper. I see it's joint work with Dyson Kim and Kemal Odan, and they really deserve all the credit for what is interesting in this paper. So it's motivated, obviously, by the recent events, Russia's full-scale invasion, and the fact that this prompted governments of many countries to impose sanctions. Now, something that's especially interesting for the case of sanctions on Russia is that it's not since the 30s that as large an economy has been placed under sanctions. So at the time the war began, Russia was the 11th economy in the world by nominal GDP size. Different from the situation in the 30s when sanctions were imposed on large economies. Russia is a major exporter of gas and oil, and the global economy is a lot more integrated than it was when sanctions were imposed in the 1930s. And so the goal of this paper is to understand the transmission and the effect of sanctions when we're looking at a world of interdependent large economies. We are interested in understanding the effects of sanctions short, medium, and long term on standard macro variables and prices, the exchange rate, measures of economic activity. We're interested in understanding who is most affected by the sanctions interdependent world. Is it a targeted country, or are there situations in which effects of the sanctions can be even larger, the sanctioning ones, in terms, for instance, of welfare? And what are the effects of third country decisions? Now, what we do in the paper is to start with a two-country model of international trade macro dynamics. In each of these two countries, there are households that decide on asset holdings, consumption, and labor supply. And there are two sectors of production in each country. There is an upstream sector that is going to produce a commodity, think of it as gas, and there is a downstream sector where there are monopolistically competitive producers of differentiated consumption goods. In this downstream sector, there is endogenous producer entry subject to sunk costs, and producers have heterogeneous productivities, and there are fixed trade costs. The model also features incomplete international financial markets. For those of you who have seen the work that I did with Mark years ago, this is essentially a version of that model that is augmented by having a gas producing sector in each country, and by allowing for some important asymmetries between the countries in the model. So we're going to study, in this context, we're going to study sanctions as exclusion from international market. So in the consumption goods sector, for instance, as it is standard in the Melitz model, there are going to be endogenously determined productivity cutoffs, such that it's only the firms with productivity above those cutoffs that engage in international trade. Okay, now imagine a situation where, in addition to the standard Melitz cutoff, there's also a new cutoff. Think of it as an exogenously policy imposed cutoff. The government says, all right, you firms above this threshold, you're no longer allowed to export your products to the sanctioned country. Or you firms from the sanctioned country above a certain threshold, you're no longer allowed to sell your product to us. Okay? Of course, in the limit, you could say the government imposes that all of the firms that would be engaging in international trade are prohibited from doing it. As initial exercise, we focus on essentially exclusion from international trade or the largest firms, because we think those are the easiest to identify and target with sanctions. When it comes to international gas trade, what we explore is what happens if a gas trade ban, if a full embargo is imposed. And when we think of financial sanctions, we explore what happens if a fraction of the household in the sanctioned country is excluded from participation in international asset markets. We obtain some analytical results, and in particular focusing on the determinants of the price of gas and of the real exchange rate. And then we do numerical illustrations of the model and the channel that determine the dynamics of this variable. So for instance, in terms of the result, consider the case in which the home, so we're going to treat foreign as the country that is sanctioned. Okay? And so consider the scenario in which home imposes export sanctions. What this is going to imply is that the most productive home exporters are no longer allowed to export to foreign. Now, the most productive home exporters, as is standard in the Melitz model, are those that charge relatively lower prices. Their exclusion from the export market, therefore, is going to imply that the price index in the foreign country is going to increase. And home exports, on average, are becoming more expensive for foreign consumers. The fact that the average price level in the foreign country rises is going to imply home real depreciation. In the foreign economy, what's going to happen is that foreign consumers are going to substitute previously imported home products with domestically produced products. Okay? So there is going to be an increase in the demand for inputs in the foreign country, which is going to translate into higher gas price and higher wages in the foreign country. What about gas? What about the ban on gas? What's going to happen is that foreign loses the revenue that it was receiving from exporting gas to home, and it's going to try to replace this lost export revenue by increasing production and export of consumption goods. So there is reallocation of resources in foreign toward the consumption sector. Less productive foreign firms are going to start exporting to home. Less productive exporters charge relatively higher prices. So what's going to happen is that in this case, it is the home price index that increases relative to a foreign one, and there is going to be home real exchange rate appreciation as opposed to depreciation. What about financial sanctions? Well, in the case of financial sanctions, something that turns out to be very important for the results is the size of the fraction of households that is actually excluded from participation in international asset market. For the effect of financial sanctions to be significant and quote unquote to inflict significant pain on the sanctioned country, you want to exclude from the international asset market essentially as close as possible to all of the foreign households. Otherwise, what is going to happen is that those who continue to participate in the international asset market essentially can do international borrowing also on behalf of the household who are no longer participating in the international financial market. So, for instance, when in our model, when the financial sanction is imposed, what happens is that foreign households have an incentive to front load investment in firm creation, to borrow for this purpose before the impact of the sanction is fully felt on the economy. And if the sanction if the fraction of households that is excluded is not sufficiently large, it's still the case that the non-sanctioned households are going to be able to borrow internationally to finance that investment in business creation that is important for the country to do. Now, in all of the scenarios, for all the sanctions that we consider, it turns out that extensive margins are important. Extensive margin of entry into the domestic economy, extensive margin of entry into export. These margins are very important for the result. And if you want to extract a policy bottom line from the exercises that we do, it's going to echo recent work by Barry Eichengreen and co-authors who argued this by using historical data to study the effects of sanctions. They argued that using the exchange rate as a metric for success or failure of sanctions is not the appropriate thing to do, because what happens to the exchange rate is going to depend on many things that are going to interact ultimately in determining whether the exchange rate appreciates or depreciates, as I was alluding to at the beginning of this preview. But this is not necessarily determining what the metric of the impact of the sanction on the sanctioned economy or on the sanctioning one should be. All right, there is much related literature that has been emerging on the topic of sanctions in the last few years. Some authors started paying attention to this topic actually before the latest large-scale invasion of Ukraine, and then, of course, the recent invasion triggered a wave of interesting literature. Relative to these papers, I think our contribution is in studying a joint international trade and macro framework, which allows for studying dynamics from the short-run effect of sanctions all the way to the transition to the new steady state, and an environment in which we are looking at interdependence between countries of significant size. So for instance, in the that set of papers, there are some papers that explore quantitative multi-country pure trade analysis, and there are some papers that do international macro exercises. For instance, Oleg Itskoki and Dmitry Mukin have a really interesting paper on the effects of sanctions in the international macro approach. But in their paper, Russia is treated as a small open economy. Right? And so you cannot explore what is the impact of imposing sanctions on Russia on the global economy, and what are the effects that the sanctioning country bears from imposing sanctions. So that, I think, is our contribution. And then, of course, we contribute to a literature on international trade and macro, joint international trade and macro models and exercises that include many more papers than I could list. Let me tell you a bit about the model. So I'm going to focus on oh wow, speaking to. I'm going to focus on the home country. Household maximizes expected intertemporal utility, standard Dixit-Stiglitz consumption aggregator and demand function. Gas production. So each of the two countries is endowed with an amount of natural gas. And we assume the endowment of natural gas is larger in the foreign country. Usable gas is produced by combining the endowment with labor. And then the gas that is produced can be used domestically or exported. And the assumptions that we make are such that in equilibrium, what happens is that the foreign country does not import gas. The foreign country exports gas. And it is instead home that is going to import gas from foreign. And there's a standard labor demand condition for the gas production sector, and absent sanctions, the prices of gas in home and foreign are related by a no arbitrage condition, adjusting for an iceberg cost. What about production of the consumption goods? Well, that uses gas and labor in a Cobb-Douglas combination, and is done by firms with heterogeneous productivity is denoted with lowercase z. They are going to produce in every period until they are hit by an exogenous exit shock. So firms, these firms are monopolistically competitive, choose prices to maximize profits, and when exporting, they are subject to a fixed export cost, okay, which is measured in units of effective labor. So in order to find the real value of that export cost, you have to divide it by the exogenous aggregate productivity shifter and multiply by the real wage in the final production sector. And it is because of this fixed cost that there is the usual Melit productivity cutoff for exporting. So standard markup pricing over marginal cost and standard optimal input demand implication for Cobb-Douglas production function. Now, as in the standard Melit model, we can define those productivity averages such that the model essentially behaves like a model where you have a certain number of firms with productivity equal to the average that are producing domestically and so on for export. Entry, okay, prospective entrants are forward-looking. They compute their expected post-entry value, given by this expression, the expected present discounted value the post-entry stream of profits that they can make on average. And this is discounted with the household stochastic discount factor because firms are owned by households. So the entry condition equates this value to the sunk entry cost. And the assumption that we make that there is this exit shock at the end of each period implies this law of motion for the number of producers in each country. Now, we assume that firm creation and production of differentiated consumption goods is easier in home than in foreign. Okay? And so whereas foreign has an advantage in producing gas and exports gas, home has similar advantage in the final consumption sector. The household trades assets, supplies labor. You can find standard Euler equations and labor supply conditions. You can aggregate all the equilibrium conditions of the model, find an expression for the trade balance, the current account, the law of motion for a country's net foreign assets. And so I'm going to, because of the time constraint, well, not quite skip it, but I'll go super fast. When you impose all the equilibrium conditions, even if this model is more complicated than my original model with Mark, and it has this steady state asymmetry with a country that is exporting gas and the other that is exporting consumption goods, you can still find analytical results that help interpret what happens with numerical exercise. So for instance, the price of gas, the equilibrium price of gas ends up, once all equilibrium conditions are imposed, it ends up depending on domestic consumption, on foreign consumption and the real exchange rate. and on the total amount of product variety that is available in the home country. And each one of these terms has intuitive interpretations that you can see here in approximately 5 seconds. This beauty, this is the real exchange rate. Okay? And it looks long and complicated. It turns out that every term has an intuitive interpretation. So toll is the same thing that toll is in my paper with Mark, the relative price of effective labor in the two countries. Okay, and what that term implies is, so if toll moves down, that means that home effective labor is becoming more expensive relative to foreign effective labor. As long as the share of non-traded goods in consumption is larger than 1/2, that's going to imply a real appreciation. This here, this is the average productivity level for foreign exporters. Okay, so if the average productivity level of foreign exporter increases, that's going to imply a real exchange rate depreciation because exporters on average charge lower prices, and this is going to lower the average price level in the home country. This is the average productivity level of home exporters. Okay? If it is this average productivity level that increases, then you're going to have real appreciation for the opposite reason. These terms here capture extensive margin effects. This is relative share of domestic goods in total product variety available to consumers. This is relative share of imported goods in total variety. If this increases, you're going to have appreciation. If this increases, you're going to have depreciation. And again, this has to do with the difference in average prices that are set by firms that trade versus firms that do not engage in international trade. And to skip this, we do then numerical illustrations. So for instance, the calibration is completely conventional parameter values. Here, the in green, you see the responses to the imposition of export sanctions. Top 10% most productive home exporters drop out of international trade. In blue, you have the import sanction, where the top 10% most productive foreign exporters are excluded from international trade. And in red is what happens when you have the combination of the two types of sanctions. So, for instance, when you look at the export sanctions, right, the most productive home exporters are going to drop from trade, and this is associated with a decrease in the home export cutoff. Okay, because what is happening is that more home firms are entering international trade in an ultimately this is driven by a replacement of export revenue. But the fact that relatively lower productivity home exporters start exporting, these are charging higher prices. Okay, the foreign price index increases, real exchange rate depreciation. This is what you see in this diagram. I'm going to skip the rest. Import sanction, opposite effect. The home export cutoff here increases. Okay, and you're going to have a real appreciation as a consequence of the sanction. Gas trade ban, a gas trade ban causes, in the home economy, there is going to be obviously an increase in the demand of the domestically produced gas, and there's going to be an increase in the price of gas that is faced by final sector producers. This ultimately has a negative impact on consumption in the home economy. There is an increase in home marginal cost, and therefore an increase in the average price level of the home country and real appreciation. Financial sanctions. So blue is where essentially all foreign households are sanctioned. Red is 80%, green is 90%. And you see, it makes a big difference if you're sanctioning 80% or 99%. And that has exactly to do with what I was telling you. If you do not sanction basically all of the foreign households, the ones that are still participating in the international asset market are still going to be able to borrow internationally on behalf of the entire economy and ultimately be able to finance that front loading of producer entry that the foreign economy wants to do in response to this type of sanction. So what about welfare? In terms of welfare, if we try to evaluate the welfare effect of the sanctions, the good trade sanctions are the ones that are most effective in terms of hurting foreigners with less welfare cost for home agents. In the case of the gas trade ban, that in welfare terms ends up being more costly for home agents than for foreign agents. And this is the last thing I'm going to say. This was a two-country exercise, and of course, as a two-country exercise, it cannot explore very important questions. So we have done also a three-country version of the model. And in the three-country version of the model, not surprisingly, if you impose a gas embargo on foreign, the negative effect of home welfare is going to be much smaller if home can import gas from a third country in the model. And similarly, the sanctions on good trade or financial sanctions are going to have a much smaller impact on the targeted country if this can trade with the third country. And the last point, it turns out to be very important to coordinate sanctions, to impose, to synchronize the imposition of sanctions across countries if these sanctions are to be really effective in terms of their impact on the sanctioned country. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As nice a paper as we all expected. Thank you. So two questions. One is about the instrument. If a ban, supposing a government could rationally expect imperfect enforcement or in a way negative selection in the ban because you end up picking and preventing the most efficient firms. So there's that inefficiency cost also. So supposing instead of that, if you expected it, you said, I'm not going to do a ban, I'm going to do an export tax. So what are the welfare implications of that? And then I have one other quick question, which is that your partial sanction of the consumers is a little bit analogous to this whole point of if there's a third country, because if there's someone who can perform arbitrage, it's like Omar's point about the border tax, if there is a neutral third country. But again, in terms of welfare, is it that when you impose an ineffectual sanction where third countries perform arbitrage, are the welfare implications different, or does it, hurt you more, or does it hurt you less?
So I'm going to disappoint you in the sense that both questions are very important. And your first question is tied to the issue of optimal design of sanctions and optimal choice. For instance, what should it really be the highest productivity firms are the ones that are excluded from international trade, or should it be a different mechanism? Something that we've been working on most recently is a different type of setup in which what is happening is sort of like a Calvo Ferry mechanism, such that within the whole set of all the trading firms that are above that Melitz type cutoff, right, with some probability, regardless of your specific firm productivity, you're going to be tapped by the Calvo Ferry and you are excluded from trade. And then a question that is interesting would be, what is the optimal choice of this Calvo Ferry productivity, which you're thinking of as a policy instrument, versus the optimal choice of a policy implied threshold for exporting in terms of the relative cost imposed on the domestic economy. But I really do not have a sense yet of what would be the results and where the welfare comparison would bring us, because this is literally the things that we ourselves are thinking about. And, Harry, for instance, I found out yesterday of Harry's work with co-authors on the optimal imposition of sanctions. That's, in our plan for what we want to do in the future, it is precisely to look at an endogenous choice of the optimal menu of sanctions in terms of quote unquote inflicting, if one wants, inflicting maximum pain at minimum cost. A very open question. And your second question, you're right. The imposing the sanction only on a fraction of the foreign households has the same flavor as home, suppose there is this rest of the world third country, home sanctions all of the foreign households, no longer allowing them to trade financial assets with home. But if the foreign households can still trade international assets with rest of the world, and rest of the world is trading with home, then the effectiveness of the sanctions is going to be limited. Now, what exactly is the quantitative difference in terms of welfare levels between the two scenarios? I'm afraid we haven't computed that.
Okay. So, Angela.
Thanks, I really enjoyed it. I have a question about the exchange rate. You mentioned what the exchange rate does a couple of times. And if I remember at the beginning, the ruble fell and then it recovered and was quite strong. So should I think of that as sequencing of things, or should I think of it as the markets got it wrong? and then your mechanisms came out, and if they just built your model at the beginning, they wouldn't have got it wrong.
So one thing that our model misses, and that is alluded to here again in the menu of the to be done, is the interaction between the effect of sanctions and other policy choices. Right? When sanctions were, when sanctions were imposed, a big chunk of the Central Bank of Russia's reserves were frozen and so on. Initially, the ruble tanked. But then capital controls were used aggressively. There were policy actions by the Central Bank of Russia that had a crucial impact in terms of affecting that quick rebound, determining that quick rebound of the ruble. And that's something that we're not capturing in our exercise, but that again should be part of thinking about sanctions as a policy instrument for these circumstances of times of geopolitical insecurity, war, whatever we want to call it. But we need to learn how this is going to interact with the decisions of other quote unquote traditional macroeconomic policymakers. How should the central bank of the sanctioning country and the central bank of the sanctioned one respond to this type of shocks? Presumably, to the extent that an objective of the central bank of the sanctioned country is preventing the currency from collapsing, the idea of imposing control and using that type of instrument is the quote unquote right idea. But for instance, what should the central bank or the home country do to deal with the domestic effects of sanctioning a big trade partner? That's a wide open question. So our exercise, more than anything, what I think Dyson and Kemal and I here wanted to do was to put out there so that there's this rush to think about sanctions using the various off-the-shelf toolkits that we have available. Now, in the international macro area, what we have seen is exercises very much abstracted from an underlying micro-level trade foundation. And our goal was to put out there, this is a framework that can be modified, extended, and used to think about these questions, bringing things together and having a central role for extensive margin, because we do think that ultimately these sanctions are about excluding products, excluding firms, excluding agents from market participation. And we think this is something important for the literature to consider.
Okay, so thank you for having me here. My name is Ryo Makioka. Today I'm going to talk about my recent paper titled The Impact of Export Controls on International Trade. So this is a joint work with Hong Yon-zan. He's in the research institution in Japan, okay? So this is the motivation of this research. So as you may know that the trade policy has been used so much recently to address the national security concern, right? And for example, the U.S. trade restriction against China, and also there was a U.S. trade sanction against Russia because of the Ukrainian invasion, right? And because of that, because national security concern is a big thing, so there are many research recently. For example, the paper by Fajgelbaum et al. And also Bound 2021 also analyzed the effect of these policies, right? And on the other hand, global value chain has been expanded over the last several decades, right? And for example, the 50% of world trade crosses at least 2 national borders, according to the recent World Bank report, okay? And also the semiconductor industry is not the exception, where the manufacturing process are fragmented across the world, or even including Malaysia, I think. And also, because of that expansion, there are many empirical research, not many, but empirical research on trade policy in the global value chain. There are some of such kind of research. However, according to the recent handbook chapter by Antros and Cho, they said that we didn't have not enough research about this topic, okay? And also, this semiconductors industry are very important industry in the current world. This morning, I Googled this figure and copied, pasted here. And this is the President Biden talking about having a wafer here in his hand and talking about the global supply chain of the semiconductor industry and talking about how they can change the supply chain. Okay, so in that sense, based on that, you can see that this semiconductor industry is a very important industry in the global value chain. And also recently, they put a ban on the semiconductor export to China. Okay, this is the last year. So you can see that now the semiconductor industry is in the center of the trade policy, right? So based on such kind of background, the research question which I try to answer is the following. So what is the effect of non-tariff trade policy motivated by national security threat on trade in semiconductor industries? Okay. So in order to answer that question, I focus on one particular event, which is a Japan-Korea trade dispute in July 2019. Okay. And where the Japanese government strengthened their export controls against South Korea of 3 chemical materials, and that are essential in the semiconductor production. Okay, so in order to answer to this question, we utilize a DID approach and also the synthetic control method. Okay, so here is a preview of our results so far. There are 3 results. Firstly, the Japanese export of hydrogen fluoride, which is one of the 3 restricted materials, that export to South Korea declined by 87 to 91% after the policy change. Okay, and also that export to the United States increased by 92 to 94% after the policy change. Okay, so that means that probably the Japanese firms, rather than exporting to South Korea, probably they exported to the United States after the policy change. But secondly, we found that South Korea's import of that hydrogen fluoride from the US and Taiwan increased after the policy change by 87% to 140%. So combining the first result and second result, this result may suggest that the Japan did a roundabout export. They sent from Japan to South Korea through the American affiliate or something like that. Okay? And also, the South Korea's import of photoresist, this is another restricted materials from Belgium, that increased by 340%. Okay? And this is so far everything about the restricted material, right? And also, there was an effect on the related product. So we found that the South Korea's imports of semiconductor manufacturing equipment from Netherlands and Germany, that also declined by 54 to 72% after the policy change. Okay, so that's the second finding, and so there was some spillover effect from the material trade to the semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Okay, and our third finding is that the South Korea's export of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China also increased by about 500%. And of course, there could be many interpretations about this result, but one potential story could be that the South Korea's production are partly relocated to China because they want to securely import the material from Japan. So I will explain that later when I talk about the result. Okay, so that's a preview of my result. So let me move on to the background of the semiconductor industry. This is a very brief background. Okay, so semiconductors are used in the many modern products, right, such as cell phone or automobile or even weapons, right? And also its production process summarized like this figure. Okay, so basically there are 5 steps. The first step is about research and development, where firms try to increase processing capability, or they try to reduce the production cost or something like that. Okay, and the second step is about called the designing, where the companies try to make the prototype of the chips. Okay, so that's the second step. And the third step is about the manufacturing. So in this step, the firms try to combine this designing and also the raw materials and also the equipment, and then make the semiconductor product. Okay, and once they complete that production, they bring that to the next step, which is assembling, testing, and packaging, and then they distribute that to the consumer or another companies. So in that sense, if you think about this value chain of the semiconductor industry, what we are analyzing in this paper is the impact of the restriction in these raw materials on the other aspect, other place of the value chain. Okay, so that's what we are doing in this paper. And also another background information of this semiconductor industry is that this production process was historically actually vertically integrated, but now this production process is vertically fragmented, and we know that the production steps are dispersed globally. So you may know that the Taiwanese firms called the TSMC, right? That's focused on the manufacturing step, and that's one example. And also in Malaysia, there are many companies only focusing on the production, right? In that sense, yeah, that's now it's a globally dispersed in the production process. Okay. Okay, so let me move on to the background of the Japan-Korea trade dispute. Okay, so in July 2019, Japanese government strengthened the export controls against South Korea of 3 chemical materials. Okay, the first material is as you can see, first material is a hydrogen fluoride, which is used in the etching and cleaning process of the manufacturing of the chips. Okay, the second material is called photoresist, and which is also used in the printing and image of a circuit pattern onto a wafer. And the third material is called a fluorinated polyimide, and which is also used in the production step as a high temperature adhesive. Okay, and the reason why the Japanese government put this restriction is because according to the ministry, Japanese ministry, they said this is because of the national security concern, because they had evidence that the raw materials exported from Japan to South Korea, they are re-exported to, for example, North Korea. That's why they put this restriction. But simultaneously, there are many news media saying that this is because of the political reason. Like tension between Japan and South Korea. Okay, but because of that policy change, there was this change. So before the policy change, the Japanese firms can get a bulk export license where they can just get a license and they can use that same license for several years. But after this policy, they have to get the individual export license. So that means that every time when you export the product, you have to get a license and you have to report who is a buyer, what is the purpose, or many other things. So in that sense, because of this policy change, you can see that Japanese firms encounter a larger export cost, right? And also because they don't know whether their application is accepted or not. So in that sense, Japanese firms and also the Korean firms faced more uncertainty after the policy change. Okay, so that's a rough picture of the Japan-Korea trade dispute. But of course, if the Japanese chemical materials are not so important, it's not a big deal, right? They can import from other sources, right? But actually, the Japanese chemical firms are very important suppliers of the 3 chemical materials in the world semiconductor industry, okay? And for example, there's a Japanese firm called TOK. They supply 26% of global semiconductor photoresist, according to this information in 2022. And also, if you focus on more high quality photoresist, actually this share become even larger, okay? And furthermore, okay.
I'm sorry, clarifying question. So I understand that South Korea and the world depends on Japan for these, but how differentiated these are? Are these very specialized inputs for the semiconductors made by South Korea, or could it be easily substituted?
As far as I know, it's very difficult to make sophisticated chemical materials. So in that sense, it's not so easy to substitute to the other sourcing, importing, firms. So that's my understanding. Okay. Okay. Furthermore, as I already, you guessed, but South Korean semiconductor industry depended heavily on the Japanese raw materials. And for example, the 2 out of the 3 raw materials are imported more than 90% from Japan. Okay. And also, semiconductor products are the very big things for South Korea. So semiconductor products comprise of about 20% of South Korea's export. Okay. So in that sense, there was some restriction in a very important industry for South Korea. So it's natural to ask what is the effect of that on the trade relationship, right? So in order to analyze that effect by excluding other contaminating factors, I ran this following the estimation equation. And left-hand side is simply this is a log of export value from product H to country K and the year amount T. And on the right-hand side, KOR denote the dummy variable on export to South Korea, okay? And the next one, the hydrogen denote a dummy variable on the hydrogen fluoride, the one particular chemical materials, and others denote the dummy variables on photoresist and fluorinated polyamide, okay? Two other restricted materials. Of course, when I analyze the effect on the Korean import or export to other destination, I just simply replace these dummy variables, okay? And also, this after denote the before and the after dummy variable of the policy point, okay? And also, finally, this alpha is a series of fixed effects, okay? And as for the data, I use basically the publicly available monthly trade data in 86 digits level from January 2017 to 2022. Okay. Okay. So that's yeah. All right. Sorry. What? Oh, it's in my specification, the baseline year is a 2017. Product is actually compared to many other products in this, Yeah, yeah. But of course, in my robustness checks, I focus on the same, product category. But yeah, in the main analysis, yeah. Okay. Then, it's the same normal thing, but the identification assumption, common trend assumption, that means the trends should be the same between export of product A to South Korea and the those of other products if there were no trade, not policy change, okay? And in order to make sure that this is likely to be the case, I included a series of fixed effects. And for example, this the destination country times year-month fixed effect, or the product times year-month fixed effect control for example, the aggregate COVID-19 effects for each country and each product, okay? And also, but in order to check that whether there's, actually some potential violation of this assumption, I did also the pre-trend test by using the event study design. And also, actually, as you can see later, we found some pre-trend in the analysis. So in that case, I used the recent method by Rambachan and Ross paper, and which allow me to do some sensitivity analysis when parallel trend may be violated. Okay, and also that methodology allow me to get how large a post-treatment parallel trend violation should be to negate estimation, significant result, which I found in the main specification. Okay. So yeah, let me move on to the result. So this is a result on the Japanese export of raw material to South Korea. Okay, and the left top figure show the effect on the export value, and right top is a effect on the export quantity, and the left bottom is a effect on unit value. Okay, and also the blue line show the estimated coefficient for each period, each quarter in this case, and this orange line show you the coefficient on other two materials. Okay, and as you can see that, especially in the top two figures, there was a significant and discontinuous decline in the export value and the export quantity. Okay, at the point of the policy change. Okay, so that's the first result. But also, we want to know what is the effect of the Japanese export of the same material to the other destination country. So here, I show you the result on the major destination country, which is the US and China and Taiwan, okay? And as you can see that, you can see slightly, there's a pre-trend, right? Significant difference. But you can see that after the policy change, which is after the second half of the 2019, after the policy change, there is a significant increase in the export value, right? Especially to the US, right? And that magnitude was about by 92%, okay? And actually, that might be the case that Japanese firms just simply, rather than exporting to South Korea, they just export to the United States. That might be the case. But by combining with the finding in the next pages, we can see that this could be because of the roundabout export. Okay.
This one, could you give us a sense of the global market structure for these three chemicals? What does it, apart from Japan, who else produces it?
Yeah, I don't have a specific answer to that question, but I know that I answered to him. It's especially for the sophisticated materials, it's very difficult to produce. So in that sense, I guess there are not so many firms which produce this material. But yeah, I don't have a good answer to your question. But yeah, thank you. But okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, good point. But to be honest, I don't have a good answer to that question. But all I found is just a result consistent with a roundabout export. The export from Japan to US increase, and also the import from US to South Korea increase, and that might be consistent with a roundabout export. That's all I can say actually. Okay. I'm sorry, it's almost a time, so let me move on to the analysis on the effect on South Korea's import of hydrogen fluoride from other economies. Also, sorry, this is the one I already. Let me move on to the another thing. So this is the effect on the South Korea's import of 2 other raw materials from other economies. And here I show you the result of the import from Belgium. And as you can see that there was this continuous increase in the import of photoresist from Belgium, right? After the policy change, right? And that actually this finding is consistent with a media report saying that Samsung started importing photoresist from a Japanese joint venture in Belgium. So in that sense, because of the restrictions, South Korean firm also tried to adjust by changing the sourcing pattern, okay? And also, so far, what I showed you was just the effect on the 3 chemical materials, but what about the effect on other products, okay? So this is a result on the South Korea's import of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And I focus here on the result for the Netherlands and Germany. Again, there are some pre-trend, right? And I did some robustness check by using the recent method, but you can see that there's a very short run discontinuous sudden decline in the import of the semiconductor manufacturing equipment, right? And actually, this is also consistent with a story that, in Netherlands, there is a firm called ASML. That's a very big firm in semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And their lithography equipment is used together with Japanese photoresist products, photoresist to produce the most advanced chips, microchips. So in that sense, this pattern is consistent with the story that, because of the restriction, South Korea cannot import or became difficult to import the material. That's why they also temporarily stopped importing the equipment. Okay. Okay. This is the final result. Yeah. Thank you. And this is the final result. This is a result on the South Korea's export of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And here I show you the result on China. And as you can again see that there was an increase in the exports of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China after the policy change, the second half of 2019, right? And of course, you may say that this could be partly because China had an industrial policy. So they try to produce the semiconductor product by themselves. That's why they import these equipment from South Korea. That's why there is some trend, before the policy change. Or you may say that this could be because of the trade war between China and the US. But my point is that this decline is very discontinuous at this point, the point of the second half of 2019. So yeah, so in that sense, my so far interpretation is that I know that South Korean firms, Samsung or other companies, they had an affiliate in China. So South Korean firms possibly reallocate some chip production toward Chinese affiliate in order to securely import these materials. That's so far my interpretation, but in order to know more about this, I need to use more micro data, but so far I didn't have access, so yeah. Sorry. But this is a robustness check, but yeah, I don't have a time, so I don't spend so much time. But actually, I could check the same pattern by even using the synthetic control method. This is using a different assumption. So in that sense, I think my result is to some extent robust, even though there are some pre-trend in the DID. Okay. So let me conclude my talk. So in this paper, I analyzed the effect of Japan strengthening export controls against South Korea on Japanese export and South Korea's export and import, right? And I found three findings. First finding is that Japan decreased export of hydrogen fluoride to South Korea, but they increased the same product export to the United States. And second finding is that South Korea increased import of raw materials from the US, Taiwan, and Belgium, but decreased the import of equipment, the semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And third finding is that the South Korea increased exports of equipment to China. And the interpretation is, I hope I already explained. So based on that findings, some policy implication could be like this. So the trade policy under the national security concern may cause some adjustment in importing or multinational firms' production pattern along the global value chain. So unilateral export control may not be effective in the current global economy. So now the Biden administration tried to restrict the export to China, but they also asked to other countries to do the same thing, right? So in that sense, this finding is consistent with that story. Okay. So thank you. That's everything. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. Fascinating paper. I'll use my moderator's privilege to begin questions. So you could you control for these free trends by looking at a triple difference? If you have China's imports from other countries as well, that will control for some China specific factors which are driving increasing exports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, triple difference.
That would that may control for these free trends.
Yeah, I already control a double interaction, the fixed effect. But you are saying a triple.
So if you have importer side as well for multiple importing country.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Anyways, we can discuss this later.
Oh yeah.
My other question is about. So you say, maybe I missed those results. You say Korea is importing more of these inputs from other countries.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Especially this result could be clear. The import from Belgium, and yeah, even it's consistent with a media report.
So this is somewhat validates U.S. policy that. So even U.S., as you said towards the end, that U.S. has this is now imposing other third countries not to export.
So yeah, in that sense, yeah,
It
because
validates that.
if they do a unilateral thing, this kind of thing could happen. So yeah, in that sense, doing multilaterally might be more effective.
And just one comment that I think this was also the case with Soviet Union and US, especially military technology. And there were some instances in Japanese firms and German firms exporting that. So it could be useful to look at long run implication of this by looking at some historical episodes.
Yeah,
that's just a comment.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I'll open the floor to.
Do you have any data on domestic?
Oh, actually, in the paper there is, but the reason why I didn't put here means something. I didn't find, I did only the descriptive analysis about domestic production in Japan, also domestic production in South Korea, and I found some pattern in South Korea. Their domestic production increase, and also, Japanese affiliate in South Korea, their production or sales also increase. But that's just I plot the graph.
But it seems like you could it's the most direct measure of and then these are all the mechanisms through which.
Yeah. So in that sense, yeah. Yeah.
It's possible based on that. Sanctions.
Yeah, so in that sense, yeah, it's at this point, all I did is just check the very summary stat in about South Korea production, but I want to check more detail about how their production changed, probably, or in the other paper. But yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So I had two small questions. The first, if you know how important was South Korea as an export market to the Japanese? So how much the government shoots itself in the foot, and then you have in all your thinking is the South Korean companies adapting, right? But it seems from you were saying that it's Japanese companies too. So it's an interesting insight you have is that when countries sanction or restrict their exports, it's their own companies that might not agree to try to find ways to get to foreign markets, which is the opposite of your logic.
Yeah, I think I don't have a specific number about the Japanese firms share in South Korea, but actually in the appendix, I did some analysis about the effect on the Japanese export in the other unrelated sector. Because, in South Korea, after this dispute, there was some consumer boycott. So I found out there was some negative effect, even say the consumer. Yeah, that's a good point. No, probably it was last month, was 2 months ago, right? So I'm thinking of doing that in the near future by using lifting the sanction, right? Yeah, that's a good exercise, I think, whether production coming back to Japan or something like that. Yeah, thank you for your comment.
Yeah.
Just a quick couple of things. One was a question, and apologies if post-lunch session I missed this, but was the policy change anticipated, or was it a shock? And I guess the second thing is more of a comment, but you pitch your analysis in the export controls and whether they work kind of space. But perhaps it's actually more interesting thinking of it as Korean perspective and how it fits their resilience. Because what's more interesting here isn't the story around do exports controls work, because we know they don't. It's more interesting to see how Korea, with its interesting history of geopolitical relations with China, Japan, the US, and others, how this is manifesting itself in semiconductors. So whether you pitch your arguments that way, that might be more interesting.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, for the second point, yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah, for the first point, as far as I know, this is like a shock. And suddenly, Japanese ministry announced that on July 1st in 2019, or we may do this kind of restriction. So it's a shock. I think this is a shock and no anticipation effect.
So thank you so much for the invite and for hanging in here. It's truly a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you. I'm excited to share some preliminary results on ongoing work. Standard disclaimer applies. The views that I'm about to share are mine alone, and do not represent the views of the World Bank, its affiliate organizations, or the executive directors. The motivation behind this paper, it's anchored on the paralysis of the WTO appellate body. And with that paralysis, essentially, the WTO lost what it was once known as its crown jewel. And for me, this speaks to a much broader issue, which is trying to understand whether international organizations like the WTO can actually allow or constrain great powers to exploit opportunities with others. And understanding this is at the core of understanding what form of cooperation is both feasible and desirable. Now, if this cooperation is going to work, the rules behind it, they need to be impartial and immune from influence. This is a fundamental requirement for justice. So in a way, the big picture question I'm trying to address here is trying to understand to what extent is that the case. Is it international law really just? And more concretely, I'm asking whether international trade courts, in this case the WTO, is actually blind to power politics. Now, ex ante, the theoretical expectation behind this is ambiguous. We have some research that shows or suggests that actually these international judges, these international bureaucrats are shielded away from government influence. They just go to an international organization, they check the nationality at the door, and everything is fine. And on the other hand, some scholars and some papers suggest that one way or another, governments can find a way to indirectly or directly influence and sway judges and affect their behavior. So of course, there are many reasons why we have this mixed evidence. I submit to you that one of the main reasons behind that are inferential challenges. Of course, we cannot observe counterfactual rulings. With that, it's very unclear whether the existing evidence is telling us something about partiality or impartiality, or any other sort of selection mechanism behind these judges into these international organizations. So with this project, I tried to contribute to this literature and hopefully filling this gap. And the way I do it is I leverage a natural experiment at the WTO, where specifically at the appellate body, judges are randomly assigned to cases, such that you go as a country to the appellate body, and in some cases you may face a co-national judge, and sometimes you may not face a co-national judge in the panel. And this idea of sharing the nationality with a judge is the treatment that I'm about to explore. And that version of affinity or connational bias is what I show. And indeed, what I find is throughout the history of the appellate body, there's a strong and substantial national bias at the WTO. But this is mainly driven by the US. Let me share some quick intuition about the way I'm thinking about it. So we have essentially countries that are principals, and they're delegating authority to these international bodies. And in these international bodies, in international organizations, we have agents. And these agents are these judges. They're international bureaucrats who have some authority, and they're going to be making a lot of decisions that affect international policy. Now, the way I think about these judges is that they're ultimately career-oriented, and they have career incentives I'm concerned. And the premise here is that to the extent that countries are trying to influence a little bit these judges or put some carrots and sticks, they might have an easier time doing so with their own co-national judges. And of course, and this is grounded in the domestic politics literature or domestic law literature, I'm thinking that judges can have a wide range of explicit or implicit biases. And that's what I'll try to explore. So let's talk a little bit about the case at hand. This is on the WTO dispute settlement understanding or mechanism, and specifically on the appellate body. Now, of course, it started in 1995. Now it's dead. So for the purpose of this presentation, let's think about the time that it actually worked. So when that happened, trade disputes started with bilateral consultations. If those were not resolved, then they would move to a panel. And when the panel issued a ruling, about 70% of the time of those rulings would get appealed at the appellate body. Now, importantly, when there's a panel or there's an appeal at the appellate body, a country can be both an appellant in some claims and an appellee in some others. So there are going to be multiple claims within an appellate body case. And also importantly, there are specific features about this appellate body. It has an standing staggered membership of 7 judges. They are not in residence, so they're part-time. They don't live in Geneva. They have 4-year terms, and they can be reappointed once. And both for the initial appointment as well as the reappointment, it works by consensus. So everybody, every single WTO member country has to agree, which is why it's been so easy for the US to essentially put a stop on the appellate body, has blocked the appointment and reappointment of judges. So we have these 7 standing member judges. This is one of the last pictures of them together when there were 7 of them. This is from 2017. And the way it works, when there's a case at the AB, out of the 7 judges, only 3 oversee each claim or each dispute. And what I argue, or I submit to you, is that the decision or which of these 3 is consequential for the outcomes of the case. It's not the same if you get Van der Bosch, Sitia, and Ramirez Hernandez versus if you get Tom Graham, which is the American in this picture, and you are the US.
Sorry, just a clarification. There is not a rule for which you cannot rule on your country. Like, it's just random, and so the American gets through. I mean, it seems like absurd.
So there's a rule. The rule is actually something that they argue proves their impartiality and independence. And it's precisely that idea that the division shall be selected on the basis of rotation, essentially principles of random selection, unpredictability, and opportunity for all to serve regardless of the nationality. So this is the IB. So there's a lottery, and that's the way the 3 judges get selected. Now, of course, this is the identification strategy of the paper. But the interesting point is that this rule, which is regardless of national origin, contrasts with the rule of the panel. So at the panel stage, you cannot have a co-national judge unless both parties agree. The interesting part here is that this idea is actually, at least by observers and supporters of the AB, an example of why or how the AB happens to be extremely independent and impartial. And this is something that's absolutely enshrined throughout. And to put, yes? Initially, the first 7, by consensus. So by all the countries they propose. So the entire selection process starts there. Yeah, no. It's interesting. Anecdotally, the US has not reappointed some of its own judges. And there's a lot of discussion around that. But essentially everything that I've shown you is essentially conditional on that selection mechanism. Yeah, and that's important to think about and extrapolate. But indeed, to perhaps put a bit more color into this thinking, let me show you a couple of anecdotes from US AB judges. So here we have Merit Jano, who actually, Amit, you might know from Colombia. She is being very outspoken. She was a judge from 2003 until 2007, so one term. Very, very outspoken about this independence and impartiality. Her experience, governments have been scrupulous in maintaining the independence of the AB members. I had no contact whatsoever with the US government. And in fact, US officials would even avoid extended pleasantries at the occasional cocktail party, lest even such idle conversation generate any misimpression. So the AB is so impartial and independent that you're not going to even hang out with your connationals at a party. Now, let's contrast this anecdote with another US judge, Tom Graham, who's a pro-business lawyer and who's being very outspoken, actually, a very outspoken critic of the AB, and was one of the last standing judges. He served from 2011 until 2020. And in his farewell speech in 2020 in Georgetown, he was reflecting about suggestions for the path forward. And again, this is in the context in which the AB is already dead, essentially. And the first thing he mentions that we should think about moving forward, again, the first thing is you have to prohibit anyone other than the team from discussing the case, either in meetings or in unofficial sidebar chats, unless authorized by the deciders. In other words, no partisan participation in team discussions, no private lobbying of individual deciders by staff leadership, nor part of the team of the case. So this very much stands in contrast with what Jano was saying, and begs the question of a little bit, if that's the first thing you're going to mention about the path forward, then we start to wondering about what might be going on behind the doors. So to put this, is a test with data. Essentially, I collected data for 188 AB reports. As I said before, each report has multiple claims. So I have data of about 1,600 claims. About 21% of those claims get accepted at the AB. So the majority of them get rejected. I'll collect specific information on the claims related to what sort of article they are citing. Is it an anti-dumping, a subsidies case, and so on. And of course, these are going to be controls in the regression model. I also collect information about the number of claims within a given dispute. That's usually a proxy for the quality of the dispute, third-party presence, as well as the experience of the appellee and the appellant. I collect information of the 27 AB judges, their age, gender, education, background, experience, and so on. And of course, as well as the country, to match that with the 34 countries that have been participating in the AB process, with the European Union always counted as one country. So the unit of analysis here is a dispute claim. So to give you a sense of this data, let me show you the AB rulings when the US is an appellant. Their claims get accepted about 23%, or were accepted about 23% of the time. This is in line with the overall sample, but there's a stark difference when the US has a co-national judge in the panel versus when it does not. So, yes?
So does the appellate body, the three judges, normally rule by consensus, or do they also have voting among them?
So there's an informal rule, which is by consensus. At the beginning, La Carte Muro, which was one of the original creators of the AB, made a huge deal about it. but there are no written dissents. So actually, we don't know if there was a 2-1 decision. Implicitly, and the word on the street is that it's really by consensus, but we don't know. So we just get an outcome of the panel as a whole, of the AV. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it does, but it's a general question whether this requirement for consensus creates a kind of dictatorship of the minority. You know, if you are going to say we are only going to decide by consensus,
yeah,
that might confer disproportionate influence on
Correct.
any one judge.
The weird thing is that this disproportionate influence is not being exploited by weak countries. If anything, it's being exploited by big countries. And we can go back to that. But unfortunately, there's no actual data on whether there was a 2-1 or was a consensus decision. Informally, that's what they say they do, but it's not on record. Yeah. No, I'll get back to it, but essentially, you did the job for me. Yeah. Okay. So again, if you take anything from today, take this picture. So to put a bit more rigor behind it, my baseline empirical strategy is going to look at an indicator variable and whether the AV accepts a given claim that's presented before them. That's a 1 and 0 if it gets rejected. My main variable of interest here is a continuous index of what I call appellant affinity, which takes a value of 1 if a judge in the panel shares the nationality with the appellant and the appellant only, -1 if a judge shares the nationality with the appellee and the appellee only, and 0 otherwise. As I said before, I add a series of controls on the specific claim or the specific dispute, as well as controls on judges' characteristics, but these are averaged at the dispute level or at the division level. And the way I do it is I standardize, I mean standardize these covariates, and I interact them with the treatment to get more easy interpretation. Or as I said before, these results mask a very important large heterogeneity, which I argue and I submit to you it's driven by the US. Why the US? We can spend a lot of time thinking about this. There's a large literature convincingly showing how the US leveraged its positions at IOs to achieve its policy goals. Specifically at the WTO, it's being a leader in litigation, and there's evidence to suggest that he has been able to influence the language and the meaning of the rules through informal precedent. And of course, and again, we can spend a lot of time talking about the pressure and how it has blocked the appointment and reappointment of the judges to the point that the AB is no more. And of course, the premise here is that the US might be willing and able to influence any and all judges. It might just have a better and easier time to do it with their own. So to check that, to test that, what I do is I replicate the analysis, adding an interaction effect on whether the US is the appellant in that given claim. And as we can see very robustly, the effect is entirely driven by the US. Now, of course, there are many concerns behind this. Let's discuss a couple of them. One of the potential concerns is that to what extent this is about the US when you have other power players, such as the European Union, who also have a lot of experience in litigation. I confirm that there is not EU bias. Another concern might be this is not just about great power politics, but it's more of a north-south divide, especially in the context where there's the issue of least developing countries and China has been a contentious issue at the WTO. So perhaps this is a north versus south divide or a taste bias. To test this and rule out that this is not driving the results, I replace my affinity indicator with an indicator on whether the majority of the panel is from a developed country and interact that with whether the appellant is from a developed country. And when I do that, and when I do that, whether I do that with the full sample or at the sample excluding the US cases, there's no evidence suggesting that this developing versus developed contention might be driving these results. Another concern that you might have, that might explain these results, is this is not related about the US, it's more about legal background. It could be the case perhaps that because the US has a common law background that provides them some sort of nudge or a different experience, and that means driving the result. I confirm that this is not driven by legal origins of common law versus civil law. Perhaps another more concrete concern is that this is not the US just winning because they're the US, it's because they just have an advantage given the socialization to US education and the way that that US has an imprint on international law. 13 out of the 27 non-US judges were educated in the US. So to rule this out, which honestly at face value you can rule it out because countries can outsource and hire US counsel at the WTO. So you can get that socialization to the US. China was doing that for a long time, but to more rigorously rule this out, essentially I replaced the affinity indicator on whether the majority of the AB panel was educated in the US. And I repeat the analysis and I find no result. And once again, I can redo this analysis excluding the US judges to see if there's a bite on those non-US judges who were educated in the US, and there is no evidence. Now, so far, I haven't shown you anything on whether the US is actually trying to explicitly exert influence. This is very difficult. So here I'm just trying to find, is there anything that we can do in the spirit of completeness and transparency? And we can draw a lot of insights from the political economy of foreign aid literature, where we can think is to the extent that the US is willing and able to use foreign aid as a tool to achieve foreign policy goals, as the literature would suggest, then we may have a corollary where the US might increase US aid to those countries when they have presence in the appellate body. And given what I showed you before, we can think of the European Union as a placebo test for this. So what I do, and of course this is not causally identified at all, but I look at whether there's bilateral aid to a given country from the US and from the European Union, and regress that on an indicator on whether a given country has presence in the AB. I include a series of standard, well-known controls, covariate controls, as well as unit and time fixed effects. And there's robust evidence of this correlation that we see that US aid increases to developing countries when they have presence in the AB. Not the case with the European Union aid. And this is robust to, for instance, removing Egypt, which is a sensitive case for US aid, and also has had 2 judges in the appellate body. And also, we can do some matching and get more precision estimates. And the results, this correlation, these suggestive results hold. I'm happy to discuss about robustness and extensions. Perhaps the one to emphasize is that I can operationalize this affinity in a much more flexible way, and the findings hold. I confirm that these are not driven by specific types of claims. The anti-dumping have been known to be very contentious, that those are not driving the results. And there's some suggestive evidence, I would argue, to the point that is anecdotal, about some term limits behaviors as well as behavior towards China. But again, the sample size are very, very small, so I don't want to make a big fuss about it. Thank you. So, I mean, going back to it, it's very hard to sign the bias. So indeed, as Amit said before, it's really not, at least at this point in time, it's hard for me to say whether this is the US getting a favorable treatment, or in fact, being a favorable treatment by US judges, or the US being discriminated against by non-US judges. And this is important to think about, because ultimately, I think we have an important puzzle. Arguably, the US was winning, quite a bit, but broke the system. So perhaps this is a question, and this goes back to Aditya's points, like, okay, who's really trying to control the system to perhaps really maximize what they're getting out of it? So we can get some lessons, at least some discussion points for the next MC meeting in Abu Dhabi in February. First one is we have to reevaluate the co-national judges. Alessandro, just go back to the point. I mean, right now we have a divergence between the rule for co-nationals at the panel stage and the AB stage, or at least the second tier stage, whatever form that's going to take. In the current MPIA, there are no restrictions to my knowledge on co-national judges. I think it's interesting, at least theoretically, to talk about the randomization of term limits. possibly longer tenures. The longer tenures has been a proposal by many for quite some time, and also to consider having the judges in residence in Geneva. And of course, going back to your point, Aitia, we really have to move away from concession selection. It's going to be challenging. I don't know if it's feasible, but it's certainly desirable. So in terms of main takeaways, at least throughout the life of the AB, there was a substantial and strong national bias. And this seems to be driven by the US. It's not explained by economic status. It's not explained by socialization to US law or education or legal origins, and seemingly also affected broader US foreign policy, such as the provision of foreign aid. From a research point of view, I think it emphasizes the importance of looking at bureaucrats in international politics and international cooperation. This is a burgeoning area of research. More substantively, I think it really challenges the impartiality and independence of international organizations and international trade law, even in what it was once known as one of the best examples of international legalization. And perhaps, and I'll go back to this big picture question, this type of bias might be the price that we have to pay, the price of entry to get the big guys to cooperate and sit at the table and provide legitimacy for these organizations. Unfortunately, at least history in the AB up until this point shows that this price was not enough. Thank you so much. Looking forward to your questions.
Your last point, I think, is a very nice point, because, before the appellate body, countries had a veto. They could completely stop a dispute. You needed a consensus which involved the losing country also to accept the panel report.
Exactly.
So, it's like some types of religious law. If you look at what the situation was before, you now moved in principle to a more objective standard. But you needed exactly to accommodate this paradox of a large and powerful country willing to tie its hands where, Costa Rica could sue it for losing an underwear dispute. I think the very nice point you're making is that maybe you had to accept that as this hegemonic transition happened, you needed to give more, say, de facto to the incumbent hegemon. And so one way of, but the fact that you needed the presence of an American judge on that, rather than, it could have happened even without American judges, because towards the end, the WTO had a choice. You rule against the US, there was a period, and the US will walk out and destroy the whole system. So do you make softer decisions to keep the system alive? But the fact that you're finding that you needed the physical presence of the US judge suggests that maybe there is more directive.
Thank you for that.
Actually, Eric, very, very interesting. To circle back on the anecdotal evidence, it would be also interesting to do it by separate sub-periods. I'm not saying by American judges' tenure, but that would be very, you see your analysis, you could do like, to see whether over time things changed. I don't know, something like that.
I think there's a pre and post Jennifer Hillman. So Jennifer Hillman was the judge after Jano and before Graham.
Yeah.
She was not renewed by the US, and allegedly was because of her voting on AD cases. I tried to do the pre and post Hillman. I don't have enough power.
Okay.
But
fair enough.
Certainly, I thought about this. I mean, there's if we can we get the where is it? The US judges by term? And again, I don't have power. But it seems that when they're up for potential re-election or reappointment, they seem to be aligned a bit more with the US. Again, I don't want to read too much into it, but in the spirit of anecdotes, we have that.
Okay, so we'll end this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.